Coming up, breaking news as the Brooklyn Nets and head coach Steve Nash mutually agree to part ways. We'll parse out the details of his departure, read the tea leaves on what went wrong early in the season to lead to this point, and update an Adrian Wojnarowski report that suggests the new head coach for the Brooklyn Nets may be a familiar face waiting in the wings.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is also brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. And Doug, no time for pleasantries or fluff here, friends, because as you know, breaking in for what is your second episode of the day from the Locked On Nets podcast, as kind of out of nowhere, not that there wasn't a lot of tension around this team entering the season, the Brooklyn Nets and Steve Nash mutually agreed to part ways, as first reported by Adrian Wojnarowski. A juicy Woj bomb. Finally, something to really wet your whistle on here. Instant reaction as we get into the details of this, Doug.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because of this. There's like two hands to this, right? On the one hand, you could say it's been a long time coming, and on the other hand, I'm also shocked it happened. I think that's like the world. I think that's the world we live in. We've lived in with Nash over the last 3 years or 2+ years. That it's felt like he was always sort of in the firing line, and it also felt like he was bulletproof. I'm not shocked at all. And I'm also kind of floored around the timing. And, this is something we had sort of been intimating at over these last couple episodes, is that it did feel a little more precarious now than it had ever felt to me before. And we'd entertained the idea of Nash as a coach and tried to evaluate, what we thought of him as a coach. But it never almost, to me, ever like warranted that long of a discussion, because I always felt like they were always just going to choose him over almost anything else. Like that had been sort of like what appeared to be the company line during the Durant thing, Kyrie stuff. Like it never felt like Nash's job was unsafe at all. Like it didn't feel, you never got the feeling. But recently, it didn't come from any source. It did feel for me recently like if it was going to happen, it could happen soon, right? Like there had been, the stumble was such a bad one to start the season. The record is just glaring in terms of like just how bad it is. And in these situations, almost always it's the coach is the first domino, right? Yep. Because that's just, it's harder to fire the players. It's impossible to fire the players except via trade. And that is just almost never what an organization is going to do. So in the end, we'll talk about Nash's tenure here. I'm sure there's a certain feeling among Nets Nation around how this, sort of plays out. Obviously, the names that have been floated already are super interesting. But I mean, in terms of Nash, I have to say, getting that alert at noon, I'm on a different timeline. Like whatever it was,
1 p.m.
1 p.m. Eastern. I was like, whoa, right? Like I was, and at the same time, I was like, yeah, okay, I can see it.
Yeah, and I think for the most part too is not funny, but the first thread on this was the Nets fired Steve Nash, sources tell ESPN. That was Adrian Wojnarowski's. That was the initial tweet. It was just left out there like that, and then it came back in to feather things out. And obviously, in the consumption of content, Woj knew he had about 7 seconds to get this thing out there before it started to spread. Sean Marks, general manager for the Brooklyn Nets, did come out with his statement. We want to thank Steve Nash for everything he brought to our franchise over the past 2+ seasons. He said in his statement on Tuesday, since becoming head coach, Steve was faced with a number of unprecedented challenges, and we are sincerely grateful for his leadership, patience, and humility throughout his tenure. Personally, this was an immensely difficult decision. However, after much deliberation and evaluation of how the season has begun, we agreed that a change was necessary at this time. In a separate statement, which is much more brief, Nash thanked Marks and the team ownership for an, quote, amazing experience with many challenges that I'm incredibly grateful for. I do think, and to your point about with everything that's gone on since he became the head coach, it always just kind of felt like you can point to a lot of things that maybe were out of his control, and why having someone with his personality maybe benefited the Nets. Just it's kind of slow and steady, right?
Yep.
Unfazed. But specifically in basketball terms, I guess the one thing you can look at here is saying, yes, the team starts out bad to start the year. We know 2-5 after splitting a series with the Pacers. And then on top of that, even though knee soreness for Ben Simmons this last game, you can look on the court and how he looks and maybe be drawing a direct connection to, hey, he is the missing link to our success here. And whether or not it's him, we can't get rid of him. So the coaching staff needed to have him, maybe better prepared to hit the ground running, specifically on the offensive end. I wonder if that played a factor, though there are some other things we're going to get to here in a little bit.
Yeah, so it's funny about Nash, right? So it's really rare a coach with a 94-67 record to feel like there was a massive underperformance from the team. But that's really been the feeling over these last couple of years, that there's been a massive underperformance, whether it's, not making it to the finals in the year where they had Harden. I think a lot of that was not his fault. They sustained injuries at just the wrong time. And you can always, with every sort of underperformance, I think you can point to sort of a reason why that goes a little bit beyond the coaching. I don't think we need to run through all those scenarios now. And at the same time, when you look at the totality of his tenure here, at some point you never felt it was very rare to feel like the team was overperforming what they had. Right. So because you can look at lots of examples from other teams where you think, okay, wow, they're getting the most out of the least. And we can go through numerous examples in the NBA of situations like this and there's lots just happening right now in the NBA where it's like, this team has a what record? These teams are what? And you never got that feeling this whole time with the Nets. You never felt like they were getting tons out of the personnel that they had, even in times where things got hard. And so I think when you think about it from that, when you look at it through that lens, yes, there was a confluence of factors that really were going to make it hard for almost anybody during this time. Literally anybody that came in through this stretch with the Nets, injuries, personalities, trades, demands, COVID, all this stuff that's going on with I think I'd be hard pressed to think any coach could have come in here and just done an absolute, just like tip over job with it. And it's hard to look at a time in Nash's tenure and say, this is the time the coaching really stood out, right? This is the time so I think that's where it becomes like a really, again, unsurprising piece of information here, right? Because I think both things are going to be true. I think both things in this situation can be true.
Yeah.
I think he got dealt a completely bum hand, like horrible, all-time bad hand. And short of like a good demeanor, which I think he had during a lot of this stuff, like a really, resolute and stoic demeanor, with all this stuff that happens, it's also tough to, I think, point to a bunch of times where you're like, man, the system's helping us now. It's like, it's all this stuff. So I think I'm of two minds here.
Yeah. And the one thing I was going to add into that is just that also because Steve Nash was a first-time head coach, you don't necessarily have a track record, right? Could have been another coach. Name a coach that came from another situation that became the head coach for the Brooklyn Nets and then was dealt the exact same set of cards, exact same record, exact same frustrations. You might be able to come out the other side of it and say, yes, but this coach has won other places. He's shown the ability to recover these things. You don't have that. Your sample size is only what you have in Brooklyn for him. And all of his other reference points were outside of the coaching ranks. It was behind the scenes, right?
Or his tenure as a player. Like his tenure as a player was his resume. Yeah. And I get it. Like he has one of the best tenures or one of the best playing resumes of all time. And frankly, his name, I think, is what kept him as coach longer. We actually literally just said this yesterday in the podcast, was that if his name was just Joe Johnson, career coach, that had worked up through the ranks, and this had been the last couple of seasons, he's gone a year and a half ago.
Joe Johnson, former NBA player.
Oh, why did I say that? Of all the names, I could.
Well, you could have done.
Of all the names, I could. I literally
Johnson.
Picked infinity names put together. I had to pick a guy that was named after. No, sorry. Steve Shamarkle. There we go.
Coming up here in a second, though, the one other footnote is, of course, that Jacques Vaughn is the acting head coach for tonight's game against the Chicago Bulls, and we will extrapolate out on that additional tweet from Woj here in a second.
All right, first going to tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster. If you're hiring right now, it can be, look, the Nets, maybe the Nets are going to head over to LinkedIn Jobs to see if the hashtag hiring with the blue and the purple right there, that's LinkedIn. Maybe they're going to find the next coaching candidate. This is what LinkedIn does. I'm telling you, this network, you'd be surprised. You think this network's just for, small and maybe medium-sized businesses? No way, baby. Maybe the Nets are heading over there to find their next quality applicant. That's because if the Nets are looking for this now, LinkedIn is going to help them with this whole thing. It's going to screen the right screening questions. This is perfect. Makes it easy for you to focus on the candidates with just the right skills. We'll talk about some of those candidates here possibly in a second. An experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview, Quinn Snyder, Ime Udoka, and hire when it all is said and done. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA, just like our podcast network. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Okay, so rounding out that tweet from Adrian Wojnarowski, who said Jacques Vaughn is the acting head coach for tonight, but expect the Nets to inquire with suspended Celtics coach Ime Udoka and Quinn Snyder. Among others, Boston will let Udoka leave for another job. This as much as anything. So there's two. My first knee-jerk reaction here is, whatever your thoughts are on Steve Nash, let's just say Quinn Snyder, because we talked about him in the offseason after he was let go from Utah. The second that you hear other names that could be brought in, I think also becomes an immediate referendum on Steve Nash as well, because you could probably put out a list of 4 or 5 or 13 guys, and I go, yeah, any one of them I'd take over Steve Nash. If you just said apples to apples, do you want them? So that also is what moves the needle for the franchise to make this decision. Before we get into the specifics of these two coaches, though, as viable options, and maybe even most specifically Ime Udoka, who feels like the banished son who could return a hero back to Brooklyn and was well regarded and liked specifically by Kevin Durant from all reports. Do you think that does this feel like a calculated and comfortable decision that the Nets made, or does this feel like the season wasn't starting well and this is our all-in moment? Like, if this doesn't mean that we're not maybe trading players here in a couple of weeks as well. This just means that we need to push every possible button to try to find the success.
Yeah, you mean is like this is the first domino of many that could fall? That's hard to tell. I think that I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility. I think that there's probably a great hope right now that this is something like a reset button that they desperately need. Reset. My guess is that a guy like Nash understands the business of the NBA as good as anybody. And so, and honestly, it's funny when people say things are mutual, to quote Michael Scott, it almost never is, but in this case it might have been, right? So like, I think that I wouldn't be shocked if this really was mutual. Like, I never felt like Nash was having a particularly fun time with this gig. There's been so many things that have happened that it would feel shocking if he was like, this is an absolute blast, right?
Walks into Sean Mark's office. Listen, Steve. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks so much.
Yeah, this is just like absolute A+. There's just almost no possible way. And so when you hear a mutual move, it's very difficult to take that at face value. In this case, I wouldn't be shocked. It's what's keeping Steve Nash here. It's not working. It started off poorly. It doesn't seem like it's all that fun. Maybe maybe you're not blending with some of the personalities here either. They're coming off a controversy with one of the players. They're coming off a season or a summer where the best player asked for a trade, right? Like, there's just lots of other things that are happening here that it wouldn't be shocking to me for Nash to have said, I just don't want to continue on with this.
And by the way, not to belabor, because we don't have to belabor Steve Nash here, but I'll be curious to see what happens with Steve Nash next. Does he end up joining a staff as an assistant coach? Does he end up staying inside of coaching? I wouldn't think so, right? And that would almost be the maybe, hey, I put my toes into these waters, and ultimately this was maybe a difficult spot to have the first experience, and maybe more than enough for me, right? So I'd be interested to see what happens with him if he still has an interest in staying in the coaching realms. That being said, though, Quinn Snyder, obviously a quality coach. We could talk about him. That's not what anybody wants to hear about. Everybody wants to hear about Ime Udoka, who left, went to Boston, obviously, midway through the season last year, set an absolute reset on the way that they functioned on both ends of the floor, got them to the finals. Obviously, they fell to the Golden State Warriors, but really a great turning point for the Celtics, who have always been a quality team, but have never been able to get over that hump. They have a great year last year. He also has some off the court issues that he was suspended for within the Boston.
Putting it mildly.
I don't know. We can go as far down the road just explaining that as we need to. But he has been suspended by the Boston Celtics for violating organizational policies, and now he's sitting out there suspended. And according to Woj, they'll let him walk to go somewhere else. I have a follow-up question here, but do you have the specifics just of what it was for him that got him to the point of suspension? Because I just didn't want to misstate.
Yeah, there was just an inappropriate relationship with a female employee, and this made its rounds to the news. And the Celtics obviously suspended him for the whole year, and it seemed like it was within the organization, sort of like well known. And if I believe it had been something where he had been like spoken to about it, and then things just continued, right? So, look, I do find it very interesting that the reporting from this side. So, there's 30 NBA organizations, and then there's a 31st organization, which is Shams plus Woj. That's the 31st team in the league, I would say.
They don't shoot a great percentage, but
that's right. They don't play, but they have it seemingly have as much to do with the world of the NBA as any executive, right? Yep. Just in terms of how information is passed, what is leaked here, who reports what. Like Woj and Shams are, I'm not really underselling it. Like, they are kind of like an organization. That's just how much information and just how much sort of seeming power that they have within like their words. The reason I'm saying that is because when you see who reports what, the report around, or the tweet from Woj that mentions Ime Udoka and Quinn Snyder by name, we know at this point that the way that this kind of works in the NBA is Shams, to some degree, is more of a player's reporter, and Woj is more of an organizational reporter. And through it all, Woj has very much seemed like he was reporting from the Nets front office side of things. Like, we've just seen this so many times, right? Like, we've seen it so many times where the wording sounds like it might as well have come directly from the front office. And that's just the case. Like, he has got a relationship with Marks. This is how it's been. This is how it works. This is not a negative. I'm just saying this is just how this situation works.
It just means that you can find more value in what gets reported because it feels like it's as close to the source as possible.
Can at least know who you think it's coming from. Yep. Right. So so when Woj names specific guys like this, because Shams is just Steve Nash is fired. Right. Jacques Vaughn's the interim coach. Woj is Steve Nash is fired. Jacques Vaughn's the interim coach. And hey, we got our eyes on a couple of these guys. That means, one, my guess is that those names obviously clearly aren't pulled out of thin air, right? And these names might have already been talked to the point where they might be on the sort of finish line with a couple of these guys around coming in. I would be shocked, the Nets right now. This is not reported. This is just my gut. I would be floored if the Nets did not have someone or someone's very close to being able to be hired for this situation when letting Nash go. Like, there's just almost no way. There's almost no way 7 games into the season with a guy in Jacques Vaughn who they clearly do not want to be their head coach. How do we know this? They already had the chance and they declined, right? So, and he stayed on the staff. That's not their choice. They're in the middle of a season. You have a high-profile organization with superstars on it and championship aspirations, even if those are maybe flawed and ill-conceived. There's almost, to me, no possible way that they haven't had multiple conversations with guys at this point about at least judging interest, at least judging like who they could get in the door. There's no way. There's no chance. They would never fire a coach into the season where they are as an organization without knowing somewhat confidently that a bigger name could step into the door. Does that make sense? Like, again, it's not a report. I'm not reporting this from any sourcing. I'm just saying this is just logic. I'd be shocked if we didn't hear the new coach within 3 days.
Well, what I was going to say to you right now too is, you could say whatever it's going to look like here. November 1st is today. They'll play the Chicago Bulls tonight. They have the 2nd and the 3rd off. After that, it's against the Wizards the 4th. Very next night, the 5th against Charlotte, the 7th against Dallas, the 9th against New York. There's no more than 1 day off in between any of these matchups until you get to the LA Clippers, which will be out there on the West Coast. You get 3 days off in between there, 2 days off, the 10th and the 11th before you go there. So for a team that's 2-5, that's struggling and wants to get on track, there actually is like a sense of urgency around whoever's going to be the guy. He needs to be in here immediately. He needs to be getting his handprints onto this team and making the adjustments that he thinks is going to inspire change for this roster.
And can I say one thing about that too? Because I'm glad you brought up the upcoming schedule. So the Nets have been dealt, obviously we know, a very difficult schedule to start the year. If you are looking to make a change in your coaching ranks and you already think this is something you want to do, right? Like it doesn't pay to wait till you go through a somewhat easier stretch of games to initiate it, because what you would like to do is initiate a move and then give the new coach the best foot forward to be able to start and get things like hit the ground running. Right. So I'm not saying like that this was, super calculated timing, but going into a game against Chicago with an interim coach, tough game. Washington, you'd think you'd be able to take a W there, though they've been playing well. Charlotte, they've been playing above their heads, but that should be very winnable. Dallas, they played that game close. Then you have a high profile game against the Knicks. And then they go on to a West Coast trip where it's a little bit harder to maybe implement somebody, right? So I think that like the timing around this is a little conspicuous also, because it might give a new coach the best chance at a run of wins, at least to start.
Coming up here in a second, we'll discuss if we have a preference around the two coaches that are being discussed here. I have a bit of a philosophical question to pose to Doug here around where the Nets organization is placing their values in these moments that could be very shifting for the narrative around this team, and then what to expect in terms of changes to the players that we have on this roster and what we could see going forward over the next 2-3 weeks and up to the deadline, because there will be someone new at the helm in short order. Okay, so my one thing is, if it's Ime, do you have a preference between Ime Udoka and Quinn Snyder? Let's just take off the table there's a connection to the players with Udoka. Just as coaches, from what you saw, tenure in Utah versus last season with Boston, do you have a preference in the coach?
No, I don't think so. Both are, at least from a basketball level, considered among the elite class of coaches. I would find it a little hilarious to bring in Udoka, not from the basketball resume. It does feel like this is an organization that would like to avoid more questions around off-court stuff. And so I would be very surprised if they were willing to like entertain downside risk around, again, off-court stuff, or again, having been through seemingly seasons worth of this, and nothing like serious, but I mean, well, I guess the Kyrie thing's serious, but like, nothing.
The most recent one is
nothing criminal. That's why when I said serious, I should have just framed that as to say criminal. Like no criminal things here, but plenty of, press conferences that aren't about basketball, like have gone on in this organization. I guess from that standpoint, if having to choose between the two, if it was just really those two guys, I would be very surprised if it was Udoka just for this other thing, not basketball related. Like he's coming off having just been suspended by his team that he took to the championships for off-court behavior. So, but he's got ties with the Nets, and I get it. And if you're just looking, if it's basketball only, and that's the only way you're thinking at this point, then I could see the Nets entertaining it as an option. But again, I just be surprised because
I'm a little torn on it. Yeah. Because
well, I'm not torn from a basketball perspective, because I think that both are just good options. Like I think you want good basketball minds in here. I think they've both proven to be that in their 10 years. And, Snyder has seemingly always gotten sort of more from his group than maybe, more than the sum of the parts. Obviously, Udoka flashed it in an incredible way last season. It's just that there's just this other stuff that Snyder doesn't have. And so that's really the only thing. And if they hired Udoka tomorrow, we would get on here and be like, hey, that's a good hire from a basketball perspective.
Yes. No. That's not. I'm not torn about the basketball acumen of either one of these options, or probably any other ones that they would put out there. I am torn from the perspective of, we're still on the heels of the Kyrie Irving situation and facing the promotion of anti-Semitic sentiments from a movie and a book, and seemingly, there is some backlash physically at the games and a presence there. We don't know what's going to happen yet. The organization didn't come down and crack down on him in any way. They didn't sit him down for a game or two, whatever it may have been, symbolic or otherwise. And now if you say we're also willing to go down this road with Ime Udoka, and I'm not here to be judge and jury around these things. And I'm not saying that either one of these, player or coach, should be chastised and cast out from the league, in perpetuity, but also there is an element of the Brooklyn Nets with everything that has gone on to this point, seemingly maybe could be coming to the place where they're saying, we've made the devil's bargain and we're going to go down the road and we're kind of going to throw out something we've talked about, that culture word that always gets thrown around when maybe it doesn't matter that much. Now it probably matters more than ever. And the Nets may be backing away from that a little bit.
Yeah. So, and just around that too. Sorry, I was reading a tweet that I want to read here in a second from Matt Brooks, because Matt Brooks and I had actually discussed this over the summer, and he has a good point about Nash. But I will say the floating of those names out there for like as a new coach, that to me, what that does signal to me is that the Nets do not intend to blow this thing up right now in terms of the players, because you do not float those names for a rebuild, right? Like you don't float a Quinn Snyder or an Ime Udoka as a team that's about to trade away its best players and maybe head into a soft reset around what they're going to do as a basketball organization. I think wanting to get established names in the door, if that's in their intent, would only make sense when you have championship aspirations.
Before you get to Matt Brooks,
we can wait till after
Nash.
the pod. We can wait till we close out the podcast. I was just that's why I took one extra second to respond to you.
Philosophically, with Quinn Snyder in Utah and the type of basketball that they ran, right, had a more traditional big, obviously out there, played off with the point guard. You have Donovan Mitchell. The Boston Celtics blueprint fits the mold, and there's the connection there anyway. So if you go with Udoka, it just feels like logical that this all stays together. I agree with you that you bring in a high-profile coach because you want this thing to be back on track and you want to be winning a lot of basketball games. I wonder if in the big picture, quote unquote, right beyond this season, we know Kyrie is in the opt-in year, etc. I do think that depending on who they brought in, and it can be beyond these two candidates that got mentioned here, but depending on who they bring in, you can probably also apply some level of forward thinking around it. Although, if you're a coach worth your weight, you're going to be adaptable to your best players and you're going to make the system work. But just fundamentally, it clicked in my head, right? Quinn Snyder ran a certain type and style of offense around certain players. I wonder what that influence would look like if it was him or anyone else who was just more defensive minded, or just had a certain stylistic approach to the offensive end of the floor as well.
I do think whoever it is going to really have a tough road to hoe here, because you're into a season. This is the personnel. Like we already know about some pressures. We have Simmons sitting out a second game going into Chicago. We're recording this before the Bulls game, right? So you have Simmons, who we're not exactly sure the extent of his injury. We know Kyrie and KD, what their games are like, but we also know this team is 2-5. I do think whoever comes in the door, it's not like this isn't like a layup job to me either, right? Like there's inherent downside risk to even taking this job, because it's unclear what this organization's even going to look like at the trade deadline, right? And so I do wonder about what kind of job. Like let me rephrase. I wonder how attractive this job is to people, right? I do wonder if this, because in our minds we're like, it's the Nets and we just need a better coach, and it's move at Nash out, we'll get someone in a different system. Okay, that's fine for fans to think that way, or podcasts to think that way. It's another thing to think about guys like this, and maybe Udoka is a little different, but for the top tier coaches who might have a chance to pick their spots, right? Like to pick a spot to say like a good landing spot. I do wonder about the attractiveness of this kind of the Nets, because it could just look different not too long from now.
And that would be another big difference here too, between, again, using these two coaches as a sample size. One coach has been suspended and is probably looking to reclimate himself coming off of a great season and then having an off the court issue. Another coach effectively just ran out a very good run in Utah, never got over the hump. They chose to break that thing down, and he wasn't going to want to be a part of that. So on the one side, I think if it were Udoka, you're saying, yeah, we're staying all in on what this looks like here. Even if it was Quinn, I agree with you. These are the personnel you're working with. However, I would assume the big sell would be, and by the way, you're going to have real input and say beyond this season. So when it comes to, is Kyrie Irving coming back? We're hiring you in, and you can tell us after this year, I want to move on from Kyrie. Or what would the intention be around Kevin Durant if he decides we don't go far enough and you want to opt out, he wants to be traded, right? You're going to have a real opportunity with assets and capital to say, I can start to build this thing up. And in that sense, Quinn Snyder certainly has a strong track record of bringing in talent through the draft, right? And building up a team and having them have sustained success. So there are two sides to that coin for sure. I wonder if Quinn Snyder or any high profile coach not named Udoka would say, I'm willing to take the rough ride this year to get to a better time potentially next year. Understanding that, by the way, Joe Tsai and Sean Marks are also going to say, and maximize this season, right? We can probably talk about this, and we will talk about this for multiple more episodes, but I also do wonder, what is the expectation for the incoming coach? High profile or otherwise, what is the expectation going to be? You need to come in here and we need to get right back onto that championship or bust train. Or if it's Quinn Snyder, can you say, we get us back to the playoffs and we reevaluate everything next off season about how we want to move forward? Because it very much does feel like the Nets organization is in a bit of a state of panic right now. Between everything going on, there's a lot of chaos around this organization. And I don't think, no matter what coach you bring in, I don't think all those concerns are going away, though we know winning basketball games cures a lot of ills.
Yeah, and I know that, we're going to close out the regular part of the podcast here. If you're not over on YouTube, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. We got 1 million people in here firing away in the chat. Really appreciative of everyone that jumped on here in the middle of a East Coast afternoon. And I want to talk about some of the stuff that's being said online, just through various Nets, just folks, and that, how their reactions to this are going right now. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Really, really appreciative of just everyone that's jumped in here. It's really awesome. And I will close out by saying, I do feel like people in some ways, and I can already tell by just the, what's going around online here between the chat and Twitter, I think people feel like this is some kind of magic bullet that is going to cure, just to kind of put a pin on what you just said, that this is some kind of magic bullet that's going to cure all the franchise woes. I would stop short of thinking that, right? Like you said, this is not a perfect situation still. I know that there's a sense that Nash was the cause of a lot of these problems, or at least on the court, and that may be the case. I don't think any new coach is just going to have a cakewalk through this, right? So I think that before we close, you want to say one more thing? I'll close this out of here. But yeah,
I agree. Remember, there's concerns around the state of Ben Simmons' game. If Ben Simmons doesn't become a better player like he once was, it's going to be some of the same issues. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are scoring buckets all over town. If the defense doesn't find its continuity, it's not going to matter. It doesn't mean that it won't get better. And this is the classic. You could have had anybody at head coach. Things may have naturally gotten better this year, or naturally have gotten a lot worse. I think it makes sense to make this move, but now it's going to be about what happens next. You're not out of the woods yet with this. And I hate to have that sentiment, because you and I, as desperate as anyone, want this team to be good and want it to be about basketball, not everything else.
All right, we're going to continue on for everyone here on YouTube. Much appreciated. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe on YouTube, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Really great to see this is one of the most streamed pieces we've had yet. So make sure you are subscribed over on YouTube.
And of course, friends, life comes at you fast. If you don't stop and look around every once in a while, you might miss out. That's Ferris Bueller, and that message might have been for Steve Nash. One of the all-time great poets.
One of the all-time, I was just reading the Shams thing. One of the all that you're going to get. I'll read this before we go. Shams is saying that Ime Udoka has emerged as a strong frontrunner to be the next Brooklyn Nets head coach, and the sides have begun discussions. So that is what we will continue talking about.
Resetting the timeline.
And we will be back again tomorrow, obviously talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Hey, listen, when you're breaking in with live information, this is the way it goes. One of us has to be speaking and the other one has to be keeping an eye on the ticker. So let's just start there then. Emerging as a strong candidate, sides are beginning discussions. This also then sounds like, let's take it back to the offseason. Kevin Durant comes in, he demands his trade request. They get him to come in the door. They sit down, they have a conversation. We kept asking, I wonder what it really was. What did it mean for this season, right? Are you coming in with full buy-in? Are you setting expectations? Is there a timeline around this? And people speculated, would Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving come out and dog it just to tank Steve Nash and get him out of there? They didn't do that by all accounts on the court. There's no way to track that other than to say they're leading the team in scoring every single night and trying to win every single game.
It'd be a heck of a way to try to get a guy out by just dropping 30 points a game in max minutes.
How do you like that?
I would take it. I mean, we saw what tanking looks like. It looks like what Harden does, at the end of 10 years. So I think. Yeah.
Sorry, no. But as we welcome everybody into the chat, and obviously, as we always say, throw the @LockedOnNets if you have a question or comment around this. Keep it clean as well, so we can get you up on the screen. But I do wonder if the expectation was a frustration around. A year ago, we could have let Steve Nash go and kept Ime Udoka as the head coach. And there could have been a voicing of that from Kevin Durant, from Kyrie Irving, and maybe other players as well. And the organization said, no, Steve Nash is the guy. We want to make it work with him. That could have been one of the first tipping points around, hey, now I look back, I don't like the way his team has been built. We haven't had success. I want a trade request. And serendipitously, something terrible that has happened for Ime Udoka off the court puts him now in a position for the Nets to maybe effectively reset their timeline and make the choice that they theoretically feel like they should have done. It's not good that it comes amid the circumstances for Udoka, but it seems like this has a lot of that sense going on here. This is what we should have done a year ago and seen what this looked like. Instead, we made the mistake, and then we watched him have the level of success that he did in Boston.
So it's interesting about that. Like, we mentioned a few minutes ago about, where reports come from. And we mentioned how, this name was floated as to Woj, right? That Ime was floated to Woj. And that almost always is a direct result of coming probably just from Marks or, his circle. The Ime Udoka dial in here on that discussions have begun comes from Shams. So now you're just getting what's probably pretty close to a set deal when it comes to it. I want to read actually something that Matt Brooks tweeted, which I thought was good. And it goes with this Udoka thing, and it goes with having to do with just like timing, with the timing of the Nash firing, because it's all kind of wrapped in. He wrote, and Matt's like, if you don't know, Matt's with Nets Daily, one of the very best basketball minds that
friend of the show,
Matt Brooks. Yes. He wrote, I have no idea what the point in keeping Nash around was if you're just going to fire him after 7 games. Now you're going to bring in a new voice who will have to implement their systems / philosophies on the fly under exclamation point, immense amount of pressure. Which, okay, that's correct. Then Jonathan Macri from Knicks Film School, who's another really great dude, he said, Matt, genuine question. Is it possible they kept him around because they didn't want to look like they caved to KD's demands? And if they started well, you just keep him. Whereas now there is ostensibly an excuse to can him, to which Matt responded, not only do I think it's possible, I think that's 100% what happened. So I was
going to bring this up inside the podcast around that question of why start the season with Steve Nash if only 7 games was going to be enough to say it's time to pull the plug on this. I think there's validity in that. We've had those kind of conversations with Matt before about the James Harden scenarios and how that played out, where Matt does a great job of going back and saying, hey, if you check the timeline on points A, B, C, and D, you can almost see the footprints in the sand out ahead of you leading to this destination. I tell you what, if that is the case, I both think it's reasonable, and to Matt's point, maybe 100% exactly what happened. And I think I think it's terrible. Like I don't if you're willing to go into a room with someone who's demanded a trade, and essentially what you then said was, and the real question becomes here, where did it ultimately come down from? Because remember, Kevin Durant's demand was fire Steve Nash and fire Sean Marks. So now the question becomes, did Joe Tsai go to Sean Marks and say, we had that discussion in the offseason, it's now time to fire Steve Nash? And just so we're clear, it may soon be time to fire you if we don't see the results that we want, if we don't think these pieces are in place and it's working. Like, if that's the case, then who cares? If you're Joe Tsai, then just come out and say, I had Kevin Durant brought in here to win a championship along with Kyrie Irving. It hasn't worked out under Sean Marks. It hasn't worked with Steve Nash. I'm resetting this immediately so we can give ourselves a chance to have a championship. Instead, this does feel clunky. And we've talked about, for an organization that had such a good run of doing everything the right way, I would say in the Kevin Durant Kyrie era, they've done a lot of things, blank words, in trying to get things figured out.
Yeah, look, there's been an enormous number of missteps here from the front office over the last couple of years, especially where I think the superstars are concerned and where the coaching is concerned. I think that's no doubt. That you mentioned that this is a front office that has had a kind of an unbelievable track record for a while, right? Like so many moves they made were correct. And it was mostly on the player piece, right? The player development piece and grabbing value off of, turning someone else's trash into their treasure. They did this many, many times over the years. And that's frankly the route with which they were able to get KD and Kyrie in the door to begin with, right? Which was to build a really, really strong organization. Since then, some things are out of their hands. Some things were just mistakes, I think. Like, I think that, and this, I think I would file this under one of them, right? Like having weird timelines around this stuff. I do wonder, like what Matt said, and I agree with this, like if maybe this had been in their minds to go this route, and when KD, demands a trade, you can't, because it looks like you're acquiescing specifically to his demands. Do I think that's a good way to run your organization? No, but I'm just saying that this optics are part of what happens here.
I'll tell you what one of the biggest problems with it is too, is this is I think their biggest failing in signing Kyrie Irving and landing Kevin Durant. Their biggest failing was not realizing that you have to accept turning over a level of control to your superstars. That they did not. I don't think they made those two moves with the understanding that that's what comes with it. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but what ends up being wrong is doing this dance where you say, we brought you in, but we have our head coach. We like what we have. We're going to make the decisions, whatever. If they're giving you input and you're not taking it, that's a bad look. If you're going to stay with your head coach and you like your GM and you want to move forward with them, then you should be trading these players, even if it meant taking pennies on the dollar, right? Taking less than 100% value for them, because that's what you fundamentally believe as an organization. It feels like they are shifting to the mentality that maybe they should have always had, but they're shifting to the mentality of, we have superstar talent. This is our best chance to win. And if that's the ultimate goal, we just have to live with whatever this may look like. And there's different versions of that depending on Kevin Durant, on Kyrie, on and off the court.
And they're coming off an offseason where they probably tried in some ways to see what the market was like for Durant. It wasn't anywhere close to what they thought his talent level was. And so they don't really want to entertain that, right? Mm-hmm. Because they don't feel like what you said, pennies on the dollar coming back. I think that's correct. I don't think trading Kevin Durant that to me was always the nuclear option. I don't think that was, as long as you have him on the team, the goal is to keep him and try to not necessarily keep him happy, but just try to win with him, because he's just one of the best players in basketball. Yeah. If you think this is like a hard reset on the culture or the state of the team, and you have a chance to bring in a guy who has shown that he can function at a really elite level on a coaching perspective, and the players like him, by all accounts early on, Nash was a fine hire with these guys too. So at some point things maybe went haywire, but at the beginning there was no sense that this was not a universally applauded decision, right? With Nash when he was first hired. I get what it feels like now, but if you go back to when he was hired, there was no sense at all that everyone wasn't just like completely on board with that hiring. But now it's gone sideways, and bringing in Udoka, if that's who it's going to end up being, would represent probably as good a chance as you have to bring in someone that the players will like actually listen to and respect. And I don't know, go ahead. And then
that's the point that I was going to make about, that Ime was there last year or 2 years ago. And one of the things that I think we universally have tried to struggle with looking at is saying, does Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and really the superstar, that's what matters most, are they listening to Steve Nash? Do they care what he is saying to them? And what right, wrong, indifferent. And I think it's maybe you do compartmentalize it from Kevin Durant and from Kyrie Irving, because I think Kyrie was more vocal about not needing a coach, and Kevin Durant, by all accounts, has always been a very coachable player. However, if the organization looks at Udoka and says, this is a guy, and you saw this in Boston, this is a guy that can be fiery with his players. This is a guy that can get in their face about what they need to be doing. And no matter how it's received, he's comfortable doing it, right? He's comfortable walking in the door and doing that. He has these relationships. That may matter as much as anything that needs to be accomplished on the coaching side of it, because whatever Steve Nash's skill set was, let's call it terrible, not a good coach, fine. But you never saw him combative, getting into, and I mean in a positive way, trying to drill something into players. It was very much the management, the even-keeled temper. And as we know in all sports, sometimes the reaction to one version of a coach is to swing the pendulum the other way. And I think Ime has shown that he is a passionate coach with the way that he addresses his players and what he sees on the court. I guess maybe you think that there's a respect level there with Kevin Durant and Kyrie, and that's going to have a more lasting impact. Which go ahead, but I think this is what makes it so twisted. Whatever coach you bring in, it only matters if they want to buy into it. Because if they want to buy into it, then you get 100% of whatever version of that coach is. If they don't, then it doesn't effing matter. Then it's all a wash, because then they're going to go out and do what they want to do and play iso ball if they want. And I guarantee you, Quinn Snyder, Ime Udoka, or otherwise, they're going to buy into it because you assume they have a level of input with who's going to get brought in here. But that is a universal fact at the NBA level. If the players don't want to listen to the coach, it doesn't matter. They're going to go out and execute how they want.
I do think you're in a unique situation with Ime here where, okay, look, whatever happened in Boston, it's clear it was bad enough for the Boston to not want to bring him back. That it has red flags all over it. So yep. I'm not trying to sidestep this piece of it. Like if they're fine letting him go, they clearly aren't interested in the PR hit of bringing him back. And yep. So that is a major, major red flag just because of a very good organization in the Celtics with Brad Stevens and whatnot running that. If
cut ties instantly.
Cut ties and said you're suspended for the year and are willing to trade him or not trade him, but like, I mean, it might be a trade. I mean, he's still on their contract, but or willing to just let him go to an in-conference rival. Like that is something of a head scratcher around like how they feel about him. So I'm not trying to sidestep that piece, but for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to put that out there and then move on from it. Mm-hmm. From a player level, the only person that probably has a chance with guys like this, with KD and Kyrie now, and maybe just like as the team as a whole, is a guy that you, from an organizational level, from a basketball perspective, would have a very hard time going back at after the success Ime just had in one season with Boston. Right? It's like no matter who you are now, if you're the Nets and you're the Nets brass and you're looking at this and saying, who would get the least amount of pushback or who could give the least amount pushing back against a new coach? It probably is him because like he just came off of vastly exceeding expectations in his first year as a head coach with Boston to the point where any player from a basketball perspective, any player that went back and said, I'm not going to do it that way, I'm going to do it my own way, actually probably would look pretty silly, right? Because it wouldn't line up with Ime's current resume on the basketball court. These things can always change. The resume can change very, very quickly. Like look at Frank Vogel's resume. That went from championship to fired in 2 seasons. So your resume can change very fast. But right now, the basketball resume for Ime is almost as good as it gets. First season, took a team that nobody thought was going to go to the championship midway through the season. No one thought they were going to get that far, and took them there on a lot of talent and a scheme and system that everyone bought into across the board, and they implemented with near perfection. The Nets saw it firsthand when they just completely destroyed them in the first round and, like swept them and then go on to face the Warriors. If you're looking for a coach right now that the players will almost have to buy into just because of the optics around that, Ime actually is kind of the perfect choice, right?
Yeah, and even like to mention Quinn Snyder, since he was the one that was brought up here as well. While he has a track record of success, the end of his tenure was this didn't work out. We didn't achieve the ultimate goal, and we're going to rebuild it. Ime was just scratching the surface of the highest level.
Who else can you say that about? Kerr? I mean, there's the list is short. I'm just saying, like now, people that he's not available, obviously, but right now, of coaches you could bring in where your superstars would be almost no choice but to buy into it because of just like what his, at least in basketball terms, what his like standing looks like right now. The list is so short because everyone else you can kind of poke holes in. Right. So and the list is so long too, like D'Antoni. I mean,
well, I was going to say not to go a mile wide and an inch deep on this here, but you are saying like bring in Mike D'Antoni, offensive genius. It did look good with him. Again, you don't have James Harden there anymore. Not necessarily the same value in that. Steve Nash, by the way, isn't there anymore, which was one of the ties that had Mike D'Antoni come in here. A lot of people are saying Mark Jackson should either maybe be discussed or should be brought in underneath Udoka.
I don't even want to talk about that. That name is thrown on every single time. There's nothing to it. Like, move on.
And I'm happy to move that past that one as well. A few people are mentioning Sam Cassell inside of here, which I know he has been around on coaching staffs for a while. But I think the weird.
What are you going to do? Like an ex-point guard that like has some? I mean, they just have to do a different thing here. Like they have to do a different thing. And look, if it doesn't become Ime, I don't know what ends up happening here. All I'm saying is this is why if you go through the rest of the list, I can poke holes just around the narrative around all of them. Not necessarily I'm not even making an anti-coaching stance. I'm sure these guys are all great coaches, right?
Well, but if you're going to say that though, then the narrative around Udoka as in totality, coach and person.
Oh yeah, of course. I said that at the beginning.
It
looks terrible. They're going to have to. It's like in some ways, like who would be the big winner? I'll tell you right now, who would be the huge winner in them hiring Udoka is Kyrie, because no one would ever. There's that like he'll get out of the headlines for the foreseeable future just because of how the news cycle works, right?
Yeah.
If you hire a guy because they're going to have to answer all these questions, they must be desperate because, like, again, to hire a guy that has a huge amount of question marks around him, like, again, that's not exactly the easiest PR lift. That's fraught with peril.
This is just for fun. Fine, you win, Jeff Van Gundy. I like it. This is what we want. We want a little bit of this energy in the room.
He would never do it. He would just never do it because, like, again, this is the other situation with the Nets here. They're in the weirdest position. And maybe Ime Udoka and the Nets are perfect for each other at this very moment in time.
Right.
Because
it's all been bad.
Because it's like no one that's I'd be shocked if anyone really well established that maybe wanted another gig down the line would want to take this job right now. Because there's just too many ways for it to go bad. So you have that group. So whatever that list looks like, I'd be shocked if anyone wanted a part of it because they're like, hey, if my name's still in relatively good coaching standing here, other jobs will always be available in the coming years. I'll just wait it out.
For it to be worse. And
I'll just wait it out, and I'll wait it out and pick like a situation that is a little more handpicked. So I think you can knock that group out right away because why would you touch this situation? The Nets perspective, they can't hire a nobody because there's just too much of a chance the guys won't listen to him at all or her. So you can't do that. So that takes out that group. Right. And I mean, nobody, I mean, like someone who's worked their way up as like an assistant coach who maybe is a smaller name or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that takes away that group. You're not going to hire anyone internally. So that's the end of that group. So who's left? I mean, who's left? You're left with a guy whose stock has fallen considerably, who has I think maybe it's just a candidacy of one. Like I really can't see it happening for all these other people because either the Nets wouldn't do it or the other guy wouldn't do it. And so who are you left with?
Yeah. Misery loves company. And the other part of it too. Now, I know it's such a footnote to it, but again, if you think about bringing in a new head coach and then turning over a staff in mid-flow, in mid-season, while you're playing basketball games that matter, the fact that Udoka has ties to the coaching staff already, it means that Jacques Vaughn, Mr. Active, Mr. Manager here, can go right back to his role, and you can actually potentially.
Well, this is hilarious. I'm just going to pause you real quick because we're going to have to redo. This is like 3 separate redo podcasts because
so good.
Now Woj has just tweeted, Ime Udoka has emerged as the likely next coach, and his hiring could be finalized as soon as the next 24 to 48, which just means it's done. That means it's done.
We got one game tonight, and then you are in as the head coach before we have 2 days off for you to implement this brand new
welcome
system.
to be in a world of everyone that's in YouTube right now. Welcome to what it's like being a podcaster, because now we got to go record a whole new podcast where Ime Udoka is the coach. This is just how this works. So
break that down.
If you can see my mind working briefly through this, it's because we just recorded tomorrow's podcast. And now we got to do another podcast where Ime Udoka is the coach. So we'll have to do that when we're done with this YouTube, I think.
Sorry, I just didn't know. I was just doing mental gymnastics. The good news is this one was live, obviously, on YouTube. So we got to have this real-time discussion with everybody. And then we can go ahead and reset this table. Listen, in the old, everyone is deserving of second chances. I'm on board with the Ime Udoka hire. I think it's not the greatest look, and you outlined a pretty good scenario of saying who is available and who makes sense and who would want to take this job. It kind of does all align in a lot of ways here around Ime Udoka coming back to the Brooklyn Nets. Fans are going to love this. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are most likely going to love this.
I'm not sure about the fans on that, by the way, but we'll see.
Well, yeah. Here's what I'll say. I don't know. All fans probably not. But the segment of fans that have been, and I'm not knocking anybody for this, but the segment of fans that have been devout Kevin Durant loyalists, devout Kyrie Irving loyalists, they believe that Ime Udoka never should have left the organization. They should have fired Steve Nash already. He should have been the coach. And last year's sample size crystallizes that. Now, what went on off the court, and listen, you can judge anything however you want it. I've seen more than enough commentary about who cares. This is before any of this news broke, before Steve Nash was fired. It was who cares. When it broke that he was suspended for the year and Boston was considering moving on from him in the long term, there were already people out of the woodwork saying the Nets should be firing Steve Nash and bringing him in. So the scrupulous nature of wanting to win basketball games, I get how wide that reaches. But again, I am pro second chance opportunities. I'm also going to be curious to see how the fan base overall will react and on the heels of what's gone on with Kyrie.
All right, look,
Yeah.
I think this is what we're going to do here because I'm going to make a decision on the fly. For those that are still in YouTube, we're going to fire up another live YouTube here in a second because we got to do this as a separate episode. This is just how it works. Because the news, just by the way, the way the podcasting world works is you got to have the the title and everything kind of be dialed in around this. And I'm it pains me to say this because there's so many people in YouTube right now. But I think
you're about to see me create the new live. You go right from here into that.
Yeah, we're gonna make a separate episode to talk about Ime Udoka specifically, likely becoming the Nets. Here, I'll do it here. The next Nets head coach. I got it. Not official yet, but when you have guys like Shams and Woj tweeting out all but saying it, you can kind of say to yourself, that's going to happen short of something crazy happening. So we're going to fire up another YouTube. Really appreciate everyone that's jumped into here. Hope everyone jumps back into the other one. If not, we totally understand, but that's just the way we're going to roll this after an hour. And like I said, this is not non-Nash aside. Again, we say this after everything, but the numbers keep growing and I become even more just glad and happy and all this other stuff, all the other superlatives you could use to just see so many people wanting to talk Brooklyn Nets and being along for a ride with us. So we're going to restart this thing here in a few moments on YouTube. Go check it out. Really appreciate everyone jumping into this live.
You better believe it, friends. Be good. We'll be back momentarily.